final session of today. It's about a panel discussion on growth drivers for semiconductors. At the outset, I would like to call upon the moderator for this session, Mr. Rajan Vagadia, the Vice President and President of Qualcomm India Private Limited. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the final session and we need to energize ourselves by putting our hands together. I'm sure you're going to do that. Mrs. Jaya Jagdish, the country head and CVP Silicon Engineering of AMD India Private Limited. Welcome to you, ma'am. Mr. Virat Bhatia, who is going to join us on the virtual mode, Managing Director of Apple India. Mr. Sanjay Naik, CEO and Managing Director of Tejas Networks. Mr. Sanjay Gupta, Vice President and India Managing Director, NXP Semiconductors. Amit Jain, ED and Group CTO of Unominda, he is going to join us on the virtual mode. And finally, we have Mr. Srinivas Satya, Country President and Managing Director of Applied Materials, India. Hearty welcome to all of you. And before Mr. Rajan takes over, he oversees the entire regional sales and business organization for the all go-to market activities under the Qualcomm Technologies and Qualcomm Technologies licensing businesses. After joining Qualcomm in 2011, he has played a key role in driving the long-term evolution, LTE, growth for India. Well, Mr. Rajan, it's all yours. And yes, take us through this session for the next 1 hour or so. It's on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, and it's pretty exciting to be a part of this very first Semicon India conference. So thank you so much. Today we have got some lovely panelists. That's also exciting because somehow I don't think it was planned, but it turned out that the design of the panelists and where they come from actually represents the whole semiconductor industry in some sense. So even if it's a coincidence, if it's designed, I want to thank who designed it, whoever designed it. But we have experts from across the industries, across the whole value chain of semiconductors. And this has been a topic of a lot of conversation. And we all who are in this world love to get this attention if it comes for the right reasons. But unfortunately, last 2 years, it came out for the wrong reasons. The shortages actually all of a sudden made us visible. All who would not talk to us started talking to us and said, again, the discussions weren't very pleasant. And sometimes we wonder why this happened, right? So my hypothesis, I'm sure people can write books on it. As Qualcomm, we have seen this across the world. Not very fortunate. But I see a lot of positives from that situation which came up. I'll come to that. The pandemic was one thing which triggered a lot of demand. Demand for devices, demand for connectivity. And these all devices consume a lot of semiconductors. So there I think it was straightforward. People knew that devices have semiconductors, so that was easy. Auto. From public transport, people preferred personal transport. And then, world over, and especially we fortunate in India, the government has been pushing climate-friendly EV push. All of that actually has more semiconductors. So auto became the other reason. And then, of course, in the homes, the home became almost an enterprise. The home became the school, the home became the office. Everybody was in the home, and what was representative of our office became home. I remember when I look at my Wi-Fi connectivity at home and I look at the number of devices that are connected, it moved from somewhere less than 10 to 26 today. And then I would say, what are these 26 devices? Sometimes I wonder that I hope nobody else is lost into my Wi-Fi. But then you see that no, there are generally 26 devices, and in US the count is more than 50. So everything that is connected is semiconductor. And then we have 5G, one of the most dramatic and I would say a very tectonic shift in the G. In the G world, when you go from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5G, 5G actually moved a lot of things because from being very vertical, it became horizontal. And as devices or phones, more 5G phones got sold, Little did we understand that these 5G phones have more semiconductors than 4G phones. As per a report, there are 20% more semiconductors which go in a 5G phone than a 4G phone. And then more 5G you sell, there is still a stress on the industry, semiconductor industry. And in the 5G phone, the reason you use more semiconductors is because it has more RF chains. And the RF chains utilize components which are on the legacy nodes. Now there are two, in our world there are two nodes. One is called legacy, which are typically 28 nanometers and above. And there are leading nodes which are, let's say, 10, 8, 6, 5. And all the adjacent components, the RF chain components typically are in the legacy nodes, which are the old nodes. And the capacity, global capacity of semiconductors on legacy nodes is not that much. It's all on the leading nodes. So a lot of stress got created because of that. Then again, if you look at the connectivity, everything is getting connected. The moment you see a connectivity, there is a semiconductor there. Just to give the perspectives of where the world is headed and where we as India are, the semiconductor market is likely to be at around 1.1 million to 1.3 billion, sorry, 1.1 to 1.3 trillion by 2030. We are moving far faster than that. From 600 billion, it's going to 1.1. India is going from sub 40 to 110. The pace at which we are going to grow is more than the world. And that's the very reason we are all here. I see this as a massive opportunity. And one thing which we have to see, why we see as a massive opportunity, is also because this is a very inclusive time for the industry. In the past, a 4G world, which was there, it was more specific to telecom. Now, when you look at it, the two biggest semiconductor consumption in the market had been compute and storage, number one, and then it was basically wireless connectivity. Now, if you see, by 2030, it is going to be automotive and industrial. That is additionally coming onto this. So, as the market grows, the opportunities are good. India actually is at the right moment to figure out what can we create as our niche or what can we play as a role here. So I have got my panelists here and I'm going to take any further time. Being a moderator, I can't speak more than what I'm allowed here now. So it's going to be their views. I'm just going to be moderating and I would start with the first question. We have got two panelists on the call, so you can see them, and four of us are there in front of us. My first question is, what do you believe has been the key driver in the growth of semiconductor in your domain? And when I say domain, today we agreed unanimously that we're going to represent not our companies as much, but represent the industry, because I haven't seen such a diverse selection. So each one of them comes from a very unique industry. So if they represent, and so it's okay if you want to talk about your company, I'm fine with that. But if you want to talk about your whole domain or your industry, that'll help. So Sanjay, if you could tell us a little bit about what you believe are the key drivers. Oh, sorry. We have two Sanjays, so yes, Sanjay.
And we are sitting next to each other. No, thank you, Rajan. Just a little bit of context from where I come. I represent the telecom equipment industry, the OEMs. Tejas Networks, the company that I founded and I lead today, is probably India's largest, design and made in India equipment for the world. We used to be primarily a wireline company till about 2 years back, and then over the last 2 years, we have now built up a completely indigenous 4G RAN, which will be upgradable to 5G. So now we pretty much cover the entire spectrum of the telecom value chain. So coming back to the answer in terms of what's the demand driver for the industry here. So few things are happening in India. As you rightly said, over the last 2 years in particular, there's been a significant acceleration to what I would say is home broadband or enterprise broadband. That basically means that a lot more fiberization is happening. Homes are getting a lot more bandwidth than they ever got before, so you have a need for the modems or the ONTs at the home, then you have the head ends, the OLTs, and then the transmission equipment, and then the whole chain. So there's a data which is growing, is in turn creating a large demand for equipment which is feeding into the data which comes out of different forms. That's one driver, which is FTTX, more connectorization of cell sites by towers. Another thing, for instance, which is going to happen and already happening is that the 5G rollout and FTTX combined together, if you take as a growth driver for the telecom equipment segment, the next 5 years are going to be very, very big for India, because less than 33% of the cell towers in the country, whether they are 4G, 3G, 2G, whatever, have fiberized. So you have still got another 50% to go. Secondly, you're going to have a lot more 5G sites. We haven't even started 5G, so you have probably another 10x of densification. Our FTTX penetration home broadband is still less than 10%. So you got another 50, 60% there. You add all this up together, it's a tremendous demand. And possibly if I look at different geographies in the world, the peak of investment has already crossed. So China is already 70% wired broadband connectivity. A lot of 5G rollouts have happened. So if I look at it from a semiconductor demand perspective, India potentially over the next 5 years on an aggregate basis, just on the telecom equipment industry for the stuff that we all know about, is going to be one of the largest consumers of semiconductors in the world. And hence, it becomes so much more relevant that we do something about it versus leaving it to status quo, which has been the case for the last 20 years of our telecom growth. So that's broadly, I would say, would be the demand drivers. I would not take more time and actually let other people speak right now.
I think you brought this good point about this market is growing. And I'll later come back to you on what role can we play, not just for the market in India, but global. But that's another, I'll park that question. I'll come back to that again later. Sanjay, would you want to share some of your views as to what have been the drivers?
Sure, thank you. So, like Sanjay, I will also put the context, my domain rather than any specific automotive or industrial or consumer, for which NXP as a company supplies chips to pretty much every sphere for embedded solutions. Technology would be my domain as a growth driver. And within technology, I will put a simple analogy that, we believe is easiest to understand, and we actually teach it to our young engineers. So the way we are progressing in technology world, it's simply we are trying to create a replica of humans. The way we think any smart device, whether it is a smart watch or it is autonomous vehicle, eventually we are trying to create a replica of a human, and human brain is probably the most sophisticated creation of God, probably over evolution of 5,000 years. And the way to dissect technology framework into that, we say sense, think, connect, and act. So these are the four frameworks. And when you say sense, every sensor today that we use, whether it is a radar, LiDAR, camera, or if you go to any consumer device, you have a gravitational sensor, you have the inertial sensors, and a number of other sensors. These are the sensors which God has given to us. And if we are driving a car, these sensors are actually enabling the driving. So imagine we are trying to build a technology for a driverless car. And if it has to work as good as a human or better than human. So these electronic sensors have to be better than human sensors. So which means we are talking about the imaging radar, we are talking about the radar development, the camera sophistication along with hardware and software. That is what the biggest growth driver that will drive automotive industry, for example, into a car electronics or IoT industry, wherever the application is for a touch and feel. The second is think. Every decision that human does, we think through our brain, and to replicate that, we are trying to develop these sophisticated machine learning and AI-driven algorithms, and trying to put them into this superpower GPUs and microcontrollers. And that's what we are trying to do with a very high intelligence, so that machines can take decisions. And not only they can take decisions, they can take smarter decisions without being tiring, without being getting, sleepy, or, without under the influence of any alcohol. That is the second one. The third one is connect. Everything that we do, we connect with each other, we connect with the, the people around us. And the connectivity technologies are the third biggest growth driver. We can talk about the short-range connectivity technologies from Bluetooth, NFC, or we can talk about the long-range ones, with Wi-Fi 6 or, the 6G and, all other technologies which are greatly coming in. And the last one, finally, humans act after all that. And they act with sophistication, with the power consumption, and the equivalent is how we devise electronics, which is extremely low power, which has the right capacity to work for 10-year, 15-year battery life, and which is not polluting the environment. And that's where a lot of electronics and the power electronics that comes, which is driving the industry in the energy meters, in electric vehicles and so on. So I will just summarize that Sense, Think, Connect, Act are the 4 technology growth drivers, which are agnostic to any specific industry, and they will remain so for next multiple decades for times to come.
Yeah, and that brings, you touched a point called AI. And I think that's another opportunity for India, AI. And when we see the role India can play, because I see this, the industry, semiconductor industry is moving at a pace. It's like a fast train. And there is a point at which when we start, we will go and intersect. We believe that AI is that place where India will intersect the global world on AI. And AI-led semiconductors. Just to give you an idea, any simple phone, once upon a time, did not have, in the main chipset that we make, we didn't have a section or a position for AI. Today, we have a part of our chip which actually takes care of AI. And that is becoming one of the big, I would say, player or a big contributor to edge intelligence. But if we have Virat, I'm not sure. But Virat, can you hear us? Okay, so we lost 2 of our panelists, Virat and Amit. Are you there? I think now we can't see them, so all right. Okay, but well, while they come up, I'm just wanting to throw this question at you in case if both of you, Srinivas, you or Jack, would want to talk about this. If you want to talk about the growth drivers, in case yes, if you have any views.
Yeah, we are seeing a hyper growth in the industry. I mean, the demand is huge, and there is a huge wave of development that's happening. When the internet came about, little did we imagine it's going to lead to so much more innovation, right? And today we see the impact of that innovation. That was one big wave. And we see the next wave happening with AI and ML, which has the potential to really change our world. So this is really the driver, the requirement for the processing power, for chip designs, testing the boundaries of our designs today. So that is what is driving some of the demand that's out there.
That's interesting. Shini, you?
Nothing more.
Okay, great. Fantastic. I think we'll go to this very famous topic of the shortage. And there are various views about the shortage, and I gave you one spin of it, why we thought the shortage. And probably I can go for a few hours because we have tried to dissect that problem of where the shortage came from so that hopefully it will not return. But one thing is sure, what we saw in the last 2 years or we are living now is something we haven't seen in the last probably 36 years of the existence of Qualcomm. So it is a very odd event. This does happen, but the severity this time has hit everybody very hard. On that topic, Shini, the question is, as you come from that background of equipment and raw material, which is a very important ingredient for semiconductors, how in your view, what could we have done to avoid, was there something we could have done to avoid this situation?
Recording in progress.
So we've got some voice assistant. Okay. What could we have done to avoid this? Is there something we could have done?
Thank you, Rajan, for the question. Good evening, everybody. So I'm Srinivas from Applied Materials. I represent a very different part of the whole value chain than the rest of the panelists here. So Applied Materials and our peers, we provide the equipment that is used to make the semiconductor chips. So it's been a lot of, we've been in the limelight in the last 12 months or 18 months because of this shortage. A lot of our customers are coming to us to say, why don't you send us the equipment faster so that we can make the chips? Believe it or not, we are not able to make our equipment faster, partly because we don't have enough chips that go into it, right? So this is like the cobbler's son going without shoes to some extent. But But this is not a phenomena which is just unique to this particular time. The supply-demand imbalances has been there in our industry many a times. It is just that it is much more exaggerated, much more acute this time. So it's a good time to ask ourselves, are there any fundamental lessons on why this imbalance has happened and what can we do about it, right? Unfortunately, the product life cycles and the capacity expansion plans in our industry are pretty long, right? You can't on a dime turn your capacity and ramp it up. From the time you make a decision to getting the higher capacity, it's 18 months or even longer in some cases. So this fundamental mismatch between the demand signals and the capacity will remain. What is it that we can do? I think we have to learn to live with the unpredictability, right? Ideally, it's great if we have a perfect projections for the next 3 years and you can match all your capital investments and so on. But I don't think that will be the case. We are living in a pretty unpredictable world per se. So how do you avoid those things? I think fundamentally the technology itself, even how we put together the equipment, how can we modularize things? How can we have a better and more resilient supply chain that feeds into making our equipment? How can we have better partnership between some of these product life cycles that the chip fabless folks and the IDMs are pursuing, and the equipment dependencies that go with those technology nodes? We have to have a deeper level of partnership across the value chain. That's the only way, I think, where systemically we can hope to have better match between fluctuating demand signals and marrying it up with the right kind of supply going forward. So that will require a much closer partnerships. That's also important because I think the product life cycles are getting shorter and shorter, right? A lot more introductions. It's not just one major product release every Christmas from some of the large device makers like Virat on the panel. As those are becoming faster, even this connection between the equipment manufacturers and the technology and the innovation we provide and the chip manufacturers and how they use the equipment, that has to strengthen much more going forward.
I think that's brilliant. So one thing we noticed, and I remember this incident where somebody asked me as a question that I'm going to ask you, he used to work for a equipment manufacturer, and he said, can you imagine what is the size of a lithography machine? And the question was asked in a way that I thought, oh yeah, it has to be something big, otherwise why would he ask me? And I said, oh, the room I sit in, I stay in Bombay, and the rooms of Bombay are pretty small, but that's the imagination I had to run. I said, this as big as the room I'm sitting in. He said, probably 10 times bigger than that. So sometimes people don't understand that, and including us, said, these machines, when they say they have lead times of 18 months or 24 months, because there's no way we can say, okay, increase the capacity overnight. No. The lead times of the machine are 18 months or 24 months, and if the equipment manufacturer who makes semiconductor, he himself doesn't get the semiconductor, then that's probably a situation we might not want to get in again. But Jaya, on to you on the talent, because a very important ingredient of the semiconductor industry, which sometimes get missed out totally, I would rather not say sometimes, most times. How would you look at that angle in view of this sort of shortages?
Sure. While the focus is on strengthening the entire ecosystem, it's really what starts is the engineering resources. If we don't have that, the whole pipeline will stall. So it's really important. There is a talent war that's going on out there. I mean, there's huge attrition. This is globally, not just an India statement. Globally, there's a talent war. And we need a lot more people. As the demand for chips is going higher, we need people who can design these chips. And how do we get that? These are not ordinary, students that we can just hire. This is skilled labor. We need to build that. We need to invest into building that. In India, we do have a lot of engineering graduates who graduate, but they're not really 100% ready for the industry. It almost feels like they'll have to go through a finishing school to be skilled with what they really need to work on. So it's really important for us to strengthen this system I mean, once the graduates come out of college, maybe the academia itself can be influenced to become more conducive to what the industry needs. And also, as they come out of colleges, maybe we can have the technical institutes. We do have quite a few today, but the demand is so much, we need to do more of this. So we have to have training institutes to train them on these specific, and these designs are only getting complex, more and more complex. The skill sets that were relevant 10 years ago are no longer relevant. So we need to not just induct more skilled engineers into the pipe, but also start upgrading the skills of the current engineers who are in the system. So both of these aspects are very, very critical for us to maintain or even look at catering to the hypergrowth.
I think that's well, Jay, you talked about this is on the design side of skilling. Something that came up was that a particular foundry had shut down after some investment, and I wouldn't name the country, I wouldn't name the foundry, the fab, sorry. And the reason specifically behind, after an investment of around $6 billion, the foundry shut down is primarily about the required technical skills to run the foundry. It may sound easy, but it is not. So not just the skilling of the design part of the skilling is super complex, and that's what Jaya referred to. I'm trying to say that even as you go to the fab, because the semiconductor, technically, if you can divide it in three parts. You are talking about the design and the skilling and all the design, which is a big part of it. Then is the fab, and there is a OSAT or ATMP. So the maximum skill is required in the first and the second part, and that skilling is very important. Sanjay, I'll come back to you. In terms of what can India do if there's something, I know it's a tough and a very big question, and you can choose to. Yeah. I'll take this. So, what would you choose? What would you really say in terms of the policy? Is there something that we could have done? Or, I know we are just initiating, and the pace at which we as India are moving on the semiconductor policy is amazing, right? All the policies. In the last 3 years, I haven't seen so much change, and in the power or the push or the energy that is there in the system. But Sanjay, you would like to comment on the policy side?
No, I think, first of all, the slew of policies which have come together are fantastic, because it's not one or the other. So I think the PLI for stimulating manufacturing, then design-led incentives for actually stimulating the design aspect, now the semiconductor policy to actually do the manufacturing, and all these three as a troika are required. And of course, before this, there was the preference to Make in India policy, which was the demand creation, right? So all the four legs of the policies are in place, and I think it's very thoughtful of the government to think of the big picture and put all the engines to work together. Having said that, I think, again, in the context of the conversation that we are having right now, which is the semiconductor shortage. So what can be done now, right? I mean, and because all the policies which are there, they will take some time to come into action and give us the results. We've already been living in the semiconductor shortage crisis for almost now 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, almost to 2 years, right? One thing I think which India should do, in my mind, as a country and as a government, is that we need to flex our muscles in terms of our home market demand a little bit more than we have done in the past. What specifically that means is, if I hear the semiconductor guys in terms of the machines or the capacity or the production, if I look at the next 15-month view, the capacity in the world is limited. It's X, right? The distribution of that capacity is dynamic. If you see what Europe and US did last year, and Sanjay can vouch for that from his point of view, is that a lot of the semiconductors for the auto industries were diverted or allocated, if I were to say, to certain countries who basically raise their voice and flex their muscle stronger. So I think India as a global power, with the kind of home market advantage we have, with the kind of 5-year, next 10 years projections that we have in our economy, I think there's a reason that the country should step up to the plate and say that we need a larger allocation of semiconductors from the current capacity to Indian demand, whether it is for local manufacturing, for local design, or for whatever. And I think I'm pretty sure that the global players who are a part of the ecosystem, with whom we are a part of the overall value chain, would value that partnership that India will bring to the table. And except that you never get something unless you ask. So I think the time to ask is now.
I think that's a pretty radical view, but absolutely true. Okay, we have got Virat and Amit back. We had lost them, probably semiconductor shortage again there. But we have got Virat. Virat, could you, and the question to you was, what do you believe could be the key drivers of growth for the semiconductor industry? Your view, and then probably Amit, you could just take the same question and you give your views too. Can you unmute Amit, please? Oh, sorry. Yeah, Virat.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can.
Okay, thanks. You'll have to pardon me. I have a very bad, violent cough on, so if I cough in between, I apologize in advance. I'm sorry the link dropped. So if I could just take this down to some of the basics in terms of numbers, because this is all about, we're going to get down to maths when we start talking about demand. So if the Honorable Prime Minister set ourselves a $5 trillion economy objective, let's start there. The two crucial pieces to that is a $1 trillion digital economy and $1 trillion of exports. The $1 trillion of exports will require at least $120 billion of electronics exports. And if you put everything that has got some sort of a semiconductor in it, it could be upwards of 200. So 20% of the $1 trillion exports is going to come from products that will have semiconductors. So that's one pillar on which the 5 trillion is built. The other is the digital economy, which by itself is supposed to be $1 trillion. And 300 billion of that is just electronics manufacturing. So these are the big numbers that own up to the 120 to the trillion, the 300 to the trillion, all of which sort of climb up to the $5 trillion economy. So that's just straight numbers. But in addition to that, if you look at the $1 trillion economy and the numbers that we are looking at, the electronics sector of 300 billion is actually exceptionally well qualified in terms of what it will do, where the numbers will come from. So for example, mobile phones are expected to hit about 126 billion over the next 5 years. It's currently about 36, 37. IT hardware is about 25 billion. Consumer electronics, 23. The other big one is industrial electronics at about 25. Auto, about 23, could be higher. Amit can sort of probably correct me on that. LED lighting is 16. Electronic components is about 18. So all of this constitute about 300 billion, which is part of the vision document which the Honorable Minister asked the industry to put together along with the government. So there is a very specific document available which actually breaks this down year by year over the 5-year period, segment by segment where the climb will be. So I think it's pretty clear that the entire semiconductor policy and the incentive scheme dovetails into this larger picture. And this maths is fairly simple to see. I think MeitY doesn't need to be convinced by anybody. They have done this exercise many times over in their head. So I think the government's on the same page. The industry did the maths on this. So obviously ICA, Pankaj is I think in the audience, they have led this initiative exceedingly well. So they've done this. So whether it's digitalization or it's electronics or it's exports, these three are the big pillars on which the demand will come from. I'll just say one last thing, which is we need to be careful about talking about the domestic market again and again. Actually, the largest market that we have is about 5 or 6% in mobile. In IT hardware, we're about 2 or 3%, of which 70, 80% is still imported. So actually, exports will have to be a significant part of what we're doing, which means we will need to be exceptionally competitive. Because even if we double the domestic market, we're still going to be about 10% on the mobile side, and about 4% or 5% on the IT side, and that's not going to be simple. So we have to target global markets, which means competitiveness is really important, which is where the big demand will come from. And then we go to the point that Sanjay spoke about. If you have those numbers, then clearly you're able to negotiate. Actually, don't need to negotiate. If you're the country that's using those numbers, somebody will queue up and say, this is what your quota looks like. I'll stop here and turn to Amit.
Yeah, thanks. So I think I can speak more from the auto perspective, and really from an auto perspective, modern cars are nothing but computers on wheels, We've seen the electronic content, per car grow rapidly over the last 10 years. It's nearly doubled. I mean, it used to be somewhere around 15 to 20% of electronics per car nearly 10 years ago. And right now it's hitting somewhere around 40+%, right? And if you really look at the number of ECUs, a car used to have, again in the number of 50 or 60 ECUs, and cars today have in the upwards of 150 ECUs. So I mean, like clearly doubled over time. What's driving this growth in automotive? So if you really look at it, there's these four basic macro trends that's driving the automotive industry, and you can speak about CASE, and CASE really stands for autonomous, for electrification, for connectivity, and for electrification. And if you really look at all these four, all these four macro trends, they are all got basic electronic content. They are driven by hardware and software. So clearly, in terms of semiconductor industry as such, is a prime focus areas for all tier ones, and auto OEMs, because that's what's going to bring in new features in the car. That's going to bring in, really the next gen mobility, the smart mobility, and also clean and efficient mobility with electrification. So I think that's what's driving, semiconductor growth, at least in the auto sector.
So 2 data points on auto, and I think you can validate it more, Amit. But as per a report I was reading from McKinsey, it says that the semiconductor content that is there in the car today is likely to double up by 2030. So we can only imagine that how much more of semiconductor is going to go into the car. And funnily, I think there are so many sensors in the car nowadays that you can't do anything. Once upon a time, we remember that you could have opened the hood and tried fiddling around with the car. You can't even do anything like that. You don't even know, because when a car stopped in the middle of the road, the only thing, when I called up the service center, he says, your sensors have failed. I said, yeah, but they failed in the middle of the road. And they said, oh, we have to tow you. I said, yeah, if I don't die, tow me. So I think it's getting more complex. There are tons of sensors, and as we go to autonomous cars, there are going to be LiDARs and radars and all sort of cameras. What that results into as a cascading effect is the data that it collects per car is multiple of GBs one particular day per car. When you collect some multiple of GBs, upwards of 8 to 10 GB a day, every car, you have to store it. You have to store it. You have to analyze it. That shows how much complexity is required at the compute end, at the storage end. That's all about the data center. So where we are headed is only a perspective of, it's not just the semiconductor content in the car which is going to fuel the semiconductor world, but it's also what happens when it goes to get stored or analyzed. To you, again, Amit, while you're there on that same thread, a question is on the supply chain resilience. So what do you think, as in India, we could have done to create a better resilience in some sense, so that we wouldn't go through this again? And that's a visual thinking, and I hope it doesn't come again. And it came after 30 years for me, so I hope it comes after another 30 years when I'm gone. But what do you think is what your industry could do to see that this doesn't happen again?
Is we definitely need more transparency, around the value chain. We never bothered from where these chips were actually coming, and the OEM never bothered to know that, till a couple of years back. But clearly, I think there's more need for transparency that we are working on now. I think number 2 is, from a short-term perspective, there are some tactical steps. I think better forecasting, seeing if we can do some long-term planning, in these aspects. Because if you really look at automotive, the legacy has been all chip. Everything has to be just in time, lower inventories, and all those aspects, and that has to change, and that's clearly what we're seeing is now that there's this full need for trying to get more visibility as well as more planning clearly. But from a long-term perspective, what we are seeing is this whole life cycle of automotive. It takes us 4 years to design a car, bring it out, and the selection of many of these semiconductors are done in year 1. The car launches in year 3 and then needs to live for 10 years. So it's you're making a commitment there when you're selecting a semiconductor for the next 14, 15 years. And you need to ensure supply chain exists for those 15 years. It's not as simple as kind of going and changing a component 2 years, 3 years hence. But we're still trying to see if we can build more modularity on many of these designs, trying to see if alternate designs can be proven when we design the ECU itself, seeing if we can have more options, proven bookshelf designs of certain circuits that we can swap, if a crisis, if we're headed towards a crisis or much before we're headed towards crisis, or have, 2 alternate designs or 2 alternate platforms that we can switch, between. And all this requires a lot of, proving, a lot of, design reliability and robustness checks, because you're dealing with a lot of safety critical aspects. Most sensors, like you said, and it's connected to your airbags, and then you have ABS, and you've got AB. You've got a lot of safety critical ECUs in the car, and you can't really change any of these overnight. So trying to prove bookshelf designs at the time when we first build the ECU, trying to make sure that we have some things that we can swap. These are some long-term, I guess, design actions that we're working on. But short-term, it's more about planning, forecasting, visibility. That's where we're really headed.
I think Virat talked about the supply chain in his part of the world. It's very different and with different challenges than what you have, Amit, in your world, which is on automotive, where I remember that the supply chain folks wouldn't have imagined when you're talking about JIT and Kanbans of the world, and all of a sudden you have to have a lead time. So when we went first to the customers and said we have a 52-week lead time, the stare and the glare, even on videos, was good enough to say that what would have happened if we were not in a pandemic, right? And we were in front of them, they would have bashed us. So that is where the world is. But on the same point on design, because you have that infrastructure design capability you've been doing for many years, what is it that we could have done differently in the infrastructure side of the world, Sanjay?
Now, I think again, to basically handle the crisis better, you talked about just in time. So the infrastructure industry was working with a 16-week lead time, So it wasn't just in time, but it was 16-week. Realistically speaking, as you rightly pointed out, I think in our own life cycle, last 35 years that I've been, 40 years involved in this industry, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. With the wisdom of hindsight, everybody should have planned better, but then things wouldn't have happened. Realistically speaking, the only lesson I think we can take away from this situation is there is no substitute for better planning and forecasting, which helps the entire chain, starting from the hiring of designers to planning the capacity of the machines, to the fabs, to the chips, and so on. That has to be done. Secondly, what is also important is that the customers or the consumers have to plan much better, by the way. I remember last year in January, to one of the leading operators in the telco in the country, to the head of their supply chain, I said that, things are going to be bad, please plan for the whole year. He laughed at me. He says, you're the only guy, I deal with all the multinational companies in the world. Nobody has come and told me that, things are going to be bad. I said, well, you'll thank me a while later. And he did indeed thank me. And he said, you were the first guy who raised the red flag. So realistically, the whole chain has to plan better. The rollouts cannot happen overnight. And that's really where I would say there is a big concern, because for India as a country, because the next 2, 3, 4 years, if we have to continue accelerating our digital journey, we do need a lot more connectivity We do need a lot more devices. We do need a lot more mobile phones, tablets, IT equipment, everything. And I don't see a game plan where in the next 18 months, magically the capacities will get to the point that we need to. And that is exactly the reason my comment was that can India afford to slow down for the next 18 months just because, okay, things happened in the past. I think it's time to do something about it.
Okay, I'm going to, because of the time, I'm just looking at the time. I think I have quite a few questions. I'm going to club 2 questions, and I'm going to come to you, Jaya, and then Shini, if you can take the same questions. They are about, what do you think? Now, in any adversity lies an opportunity. And I would say, how can we make India? And I know it's not going to happen overnight, but one thing which is very clear, this very event happening is a showcase of the realization that there is something which has to be done, and we are all here to do that, right? As industry stakeholders, as government, they are all there. So the question to you, Jaya, is what do we do to make India an integral part? Because we are a global economy, how do you make it an integral part of the larger story? And is there any policy intervention you believe we should look at?
You want to go first? Go for it.
So it's really refreshing to see the focus from the government. This is something that we are seeing, it's unprecedented, and it's extremely inspiring and motivating. India, again, I'm going to focus on the talent availability. India has the potential to become the talent hub for the entire world. The manpower that we have, if we can create partnerships, which I think is already happening to a large extent, between the industry and the government and the academia. I think there's a lot of things that we can do, and it can be very powerful. We can actually provide the shortfall of resources. We can address that in India. So it requires a lot more partnerships, and the focus on the government has on the semiconductor industry growth is great. This needs to continue. More investments need to be done, and the AI ML space will just grow this demand even more. So we need to be ready for that and plan accordingly.
Maybe I'll add a few things to this. Fundamentally, my belief is while the current shortages that are there in multiple parts of the semiconductor chain is at the top of our mind, maybe in all our day jobs, we are spending a lot of time dealing with those. We can't just think about that being the driving force for what India should be trying to do. India, and I think the minister mentioned this morning as well, right, with his 20-year vision of it, India should have a longer-term perspective on what is the best way that India can play a role and strengthen its position in the overall semiconductor system. So one message from me is have the longer-term view. Don't just think of this as a solution for the current topic, which is on top of all our minds. Second thing I'll say, and I'll use a slide as a reference from one of the keynote talks this morning when Dr. Randhir Thakur from Intel gave his talk. He showed a slide which had 6 rectangles across the value chain, and he highlighted the first 2, which was chip design and something else, and then the integration at the system side. There were 4 or 5 pieces in the middle, equipment, materials, manufacturing, assembly, which were not highlighted. I was hoping actually that he would come out and say which area he thinks we should be focusing on. But maybe there is no one perfect answer. I think India, with its unique capabilities, the talent, also being realistic on where we can enter the game. Probably, each part has its own challenges. So we should really, and I'm sure all of you in your own capacities are doing this, really think about which part of that chain where we could at least enter to start with, get really good at it, and then think about expanding to the left or right of it. And I'm sure there are multiple views on it, but I really think we need to be cognizant that we shouldn't go try doing all the pieces in one go. Any of the other regions, I don't think have done it in that fashion. Maybe I could be mistaken. But certainly given the capital intensities involved, the talent issues, Jaya already referred to it a little bit. We should be cognizant, pick something and then be really good at it and make our mark.
So I think you addressed one point, but if you, and this is great because you talked about the multiple boxes. If we see the policy which has been created, actually it addresses not probably 5 because one of the boxes was split into few, but 3 of the key ones. That's exactly where it starts. So I would say it's a great start. I think we have short time, so I'm going to skip one question, but I'm going to do the last one, which is probably a favorite of mine. And choose to change the dates if you want, but I have 2 dates in mind, 2030, 2047. They have a meaning. 2030 has a meaning, it's 10 years almost from now. And 2047 is primarily, we know why. If you had to visualize India, and this is open for, and I would love if all the 4 of you can give an answer to that. What would you see India 2030, India 2047 in context to what we are talking today? All of you, 6 of you.
Okay, maybe I can take a crack first. So I think by 2030, I mean, we should really go by the 80-20 rule, you know. So pick and choose the battle that you want to fight to have the maximum impact. So clearly, I think system design, we pick all the products that we're going to consume in a large domestic market. If we can design and manufacture 80% of those products, I think it's a good start in 10 years. Semiconductors, if we can do even 80% of the chips that matter for India, in India, it's a good start. In the manufacturing, if we can capture some geometries where your volumes would be done and could be done in India, it's a good start. And I think we can really aspire to be Atmanirbhar in a 80-20 way, because being beyond that, being a part of the global supply chain, it'll be very difficult. So I think it's good to prioritize which are the most important things. We have human capital as our biggest asset. Leverage that and really capture the 80% which really matters. And I think if we can stay laser focused on that, I'm sure we'll be able to accomplish that in the next 10 years and of course by 2047.
Thank you. If you could be a bit brief, because we will probably try to take question if you can. But Sanjay, what do you think 2030, 2047?
So my view is, like we have become the recognized power in IT and software in the whole world. This is a very natural extension that will go to semiconductors design. And while design we keep talking about, we are designing for the world. The reality is that if we want to be Atmanirbhar in true sense, and every single design that we are talking about goes to, Indian companies, companies like Tejas and all, right? We will have to have a lot of Indian semiconductor companies that would have been born by that time. And the way I was going through the stats on maybe non-semiconductor startups, the way, every few months or few weeks, a new unicorn is getting born. I'm sure in 10, 20 years, that will be a norm for semiconductors because, I would say the San Jose, if you say Silicon Valley, it's probably a couple of decades ahead of India. So by next 2 decades, we will be a Silicon Valley equivalent with a thriving innovation culture and thriving semiconductor companies as a natural extension. So that would be my prediction.
I'll answer in a much more near term. Even 2030 looks quite distant to me. I think we don't talk much about display manufacturing, LCD manufacturing, which is, I think of it as a slightly easier and a quicker technology per se than the silicon manufacturing. We have domestic consumption for it. We have domestic decision making for it. There's no reason why India can't start with that. I'm not saying we can't do silicon or don't try silicon, but I think those are the lower hanging fruits. ATMP packaging, though, again, that's getting increasingly complex as well. There's a lot of technology differentiation there. That's an area where we don't need to chase something, this whole heterogeneous integration in those areas. It's a good opportunity for India to even start there so that, you can be leading the pack to some extent. Those things, even 2030, we don't need to wait that far. Much before that, we should be able to do it. So, your prediction?
Well, I think I've already shared my views on how India can be the hub for the talent. And one point I want to make is, this is a long haul. There's no near-term solution to solve these problems. So we need to invest now. We need to have that vision that we need to work on. We start now, we'll see the results a few years later. The design cycles or the preparing the resources for the design is going to take time. So the investments and improvements, initiatives have to happen now for us to see the result in a few years.
Amit, if you could go.
Yeah, so I think I do agree on the display thing. I mean, in cars going forward, you're going to be seeing larger and larger displays, and it's going to be one of the key, factors of growth in automotive. And in short term, I see that as a great step if we could get into display manufacturing. Would be a huge benefit to the automotive sector. I would answer more of the 2047 question. From a vision perspective, at least I see if we can have at least, say, 70% of the electronic components, from an Indian source and not needing to import it, that would be fantastic if we could do that.
Lovely. I think if we have time up on our end, at least the panelists, I'm not sure whether we have time for questions, but 2030, 2047 to us means that by, at least I don't want to see one more shortage during that time. By 2047, if we are sitting on the same and doing semicon, we'll have to do the math, which version was it, but probably we would have a definitive footprint on the global scenario, guaranteed. The way we are moving, the way we have architected, we are there. In 2030, we'll be visible. By 2030, 47, probably we will play a larger role. And as we evolve, whether it is the design, which looks to be more likely, the fab, the OSAT, the materials, there is a place for India. And it is inevitable with what the government is doing, with what all, these conversations wouldn't have happened 2 years back. And if they're happening now, it looks like there are more questions than answers, but this is how it starts. So it's a wonderful time, and thank you, panelists. Yeah, we can try taking, if you have 2 questions. Yeah, sure.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And this is for Jaya.
You can.
Thank you. It's very heartening listening to each one of you in terms of what are the growth drivers and discussing about 2030 and 2047. But it's also extremely wonderful to see a woman leader in an industry where you hardly see women reaching to the top.
Absolutely.
So Jaya, on that note, you are one leader who also spoke about talent and how we are at a great advantage from an India standpoint. So given that, I would also like you to touch upon how you, as a leader, since you understood the growth pangs, as well as how you managed to move through the ladder and reach where you have arrived, and you're an inspiration and a role model for several. How do you build the women leadership within AMD and also in the larger ecosystem? Because today the world is also looking at talent, not just with respect to growing talent, but also diversity, which also means women at large.
Thank you. Thanks for your question.
That's a great question. Thank you, Kiranmai. Inclusion and diversity is not just something nice to have, it's a requirement. We can't leave out 50% of our population and try to build something as big as this. So women, one thing that I have noticed, at the entry level, there are at least about 30% women who come out of engineering colleges and enter the industry, which is a decent percentage. But as we move up the ladder, mid-management is hardly 5%, and upper management, it's 1 or 2%. It's very lonely out there. So what causes this kind of depletion? It's really the demands of the industry. And women, being the emotional, more emotional than men, we find it very hard to give up something family-wise. We feel guilty. So it's easier to give up your career, your aspirations. So that's what many women tend to do. What I try to do is, when I talk to women or when I give talks, it's not a sin to be aspirational with your career. It's a serious investment that you have done, like many other men. You need to keep up with that. Family will walk with you if you are passionate. So don't give up your passion and don't give up your long-term aspirations for short-term challenges. Honestly, most of the challenges that we as women face, most of it is in our minds, because we have this guilty conscience that keeps pricking us. Oh, am I doing the right thing? No, I shouldn't be focusing on work. I should be spending more time with my kids. Lot of conflicts, right? So that's where that kind of emphasis and creating more and more role models for women to see, yes, this is doable and this is achievable, is what is needed. And that grit and determination to pursue something that is of interest to you and not make it like an optional or a secondary thing. I think that is what is really needed. And you have to follow your passion like anyone else, and you are entitled to it. So that's the thing that needs to, I think the awareness is definitely there. It's much better than, when I started in the industry, but more work needs to be done. And the good part is now we have role models, like many women in the industry.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
On the, Rajan, on the display, Satya, a lot of work is being done on display. Probably you are not aware of it. Display.
He's telling you.
It's not a question, I'm just making a statement. We have 5 very large display assembly plants which have come in, which will assemble about 125 million displays this year. By next 2 years, we'll be assembling about 500 million displays. And this scheme is a composite scheme for display fabs also. And display is a very high focus for us because of geopolitical reasons. You know how one country has captured most of the markets with predatory pricing. But now they've increased pricing by 60-70%. And there is a center of excellence, which is at IIT Chennai, which has got probably the highest grant, which has world beaters as a part of that center of excellence. So we are trying to leapfrog in the OLED technology also. So something is being done, but we'll be glad to hear more from all of you.
Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for this session. Thank you, panelists.